that we are live.
You may have a little bit of interference there.
What's that?
There may be a little bit of interference.
Do you mean delay or?
Oh, no, seems okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. So let me just welcome everyone. First of all, I mean, we want to welcome everyone who watches this event live, as well as everyone who will be watching it in days and weeks to come. I'll introduce myself quickly first, along with my partner and colleague here, Alex Wall. We are the publishers of the book Strategic Humanism by Claudia Hauer. Our publishing company is called Political Animal Press. It takes its name from Aristotle's teaching that human beings are by nature political animals. And Aristotle, of course, figures in a big way in Claudia's book. This is an excellent book that we are tremendously proud to be publishing. It is a book that gives an expert reading of important figures of the past and makes them speak to our current condition. So it's fundamentally, I think, a forward-looking book. It looks forward to a time when certain human characteristics can be cultivated again for the sake of good leadership and good strategic thinking in politics, in war, in peace. Claudia's book is therefore highly representative of the kind of thing that our press is meant to publish. We are trying to create a place in the world where serious and intelligent people of any kind can discuss and learn about political things in a serious manner. This is a time where we need, of course, less sensationalism, less partisanship, less jargon, and less unnecessary specialization. Human beings want to think and talk about serious things. That is what Political Animal Press is meant to do, and that's why Claudia's wonderful book is so representative of what we're trying to do. With that, I will turn things over quickly to Alex Wall, who's co-founder and managing editor at the press, and let him introduce everyone.
Thanks, Louis. Yeah, Claudia's book is something that we're immensely proud of, and so with that, I'll get on to the introductions. Claudia Hauer is the author of Strategic Humanism. She's a tutor at St. John's College, Santa Fe, and she's a former distinguished visiting professor at the Air Force Academy in the Department of English and the Fine Arts, and also the former Lyon Chair in Professional Ethics in the Department of Philosophy. Tonight's lead discussant is Thomas Mcguire. He's an associate professor of English at the U.S. Air Force Academy, and he's also the director of the Air Force Humanities Institute. And some of you may know him also as the poetry editor for War, Literature, and the Arts. Also joining us from the Air Force Academy is Professor Amy Cooper from the English and Fine Arts Department, and from St. John's College, Annapolis, Jeff Black. Hi, Mr. Black. Mr. Black is very dear to me as one of my former tutors at St. John's, and more relevant to tonight's discussion, he was also a visiting professor at the Air Force Academy in the Department of Political Science and a fellow in I think, Civil Military Relations at the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the U.S. Naval Academy. So those are the panelists for tonight's discussion. On a technical note, if you want to ask a question or add something to the discussion, please either leave a comment on this post on Facebook or send a direct message to Political Animal Press through Facebook. We will be checking those afterwards because we know most of you are probably not going to be able to join us live. And if there's any follow-up, we will arrange that with the panelists and post it here. So with that, over to you, Thomas.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks, Alex, and Amy, and Claudia, and Louis.
You sound muted.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Louis, great.
You need says he's not muted, but we're not hearing you, Tom.
Can you hear me now?
No.
Turn up your computer volume, Tom. You're very faint.
Yeah, I do hear Tom, just very quietly.
Did a sound check just a moment ago.
You need to go to audio settings and turn up your input. It's at the little caret next to the mute button. Audio settings, and then it.
Already.
Oh, okay.
I'm at the top, and I
There
was.
we go. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. We did. Sorry, folks out there in viewer land. We did a sound check prior, and I think maybe when we switched to live stream, something happened with my
It's
sound.
working fine now.
Great. So I just wanted to first start by congratulating Claudia on her achievement, and I wanted to thank Amy and Jeff for joining us in this discussion. And I thought I'd start by means of introducing and framing Claudia's book. I thought I'd start by asking Claudia if you could speak a little bit about the impetus for the book. When you started this project, did you have a clear aim or research objective in mind, or how did the book come together?
Yeah, I talk in the introduction about, I think it was my second day teaching at the Air Force Academy. And I walked into class, we were going to do a Thucydides reading, and a cadet raised his hand, and right away he said, "Why are we still reading this?" And I had this like revelation that like two things were perfectly clear to me in that moment. One was that I had never considered that we wouldn't still read it, and he had actually never considered that we would. And it got me thinking, how could we make a compelling case? How can we build a compelling case that these older ancient texts are still relevant, part of a military officer's education? So I started, clickety-clack. I got into Herodotus first. It's always seemed to me that Herodotus really gets it the way the Greeks really chaotically and, totally chaotically tried to come together to resist the Persian invasions, vastly outnumbered, but with huge obstacles to face, connecting the polis concept with a kind of notion of there's a nation at work here now too. And I started thinking about the birth of democracy, the genesis of this notion of individual freedom. Then I went back to Homer because, I was familiar with Jonathan Shea's book, and I knew that how paradigmatic Achilles has always been of the betrayed warrior who turns to grief and rage after the betrayal of the commander. And then I kind of did the Thucydides chapter looking at the sort of self-implosion of this fledgling democracy in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian Wars. And I've always been fascinated by the way that moral philosophy got its birth in the West, in the moral vacuum that was left in the aftermath of this Athenian defeat brought about by their own hubris and their own overreach. And so I wanted to put that touchstone in there as well, that we have people now like Aristotle going around and asking, what does this moral terminology mean? What does justice mean? So then it was a book. I mean, that's kind of how it was never really intended to be a book until it became a book. And then I felt like there was one additional piece that I had to put in there, which is that it seemed really evident to me that day in the classroom that the reason the cadet didn't accept that these texts should still be read was because he understood that the technocratic Cartesian paradigm with its data-driven and science-driven approaches to human problems had somehow swept away the need for this much more primary way of discovering who we are as human beings that I think the Greek literature represents. So I did put that piece in there. I know it's kind of a macroscopic book. I had always hoped from the beginning that it would be accessible and that it would make the case, not just to an academic, but to a student like that, yeah, we need to know this story. This is our story as well, in a way. So yeah, thanks, Tom. Great question.
Yeah. Well, I'm a retired Air Force officer. I spent 24 years in uniform, and your experience with the cadet, I'll tell you, is not isolated. I've had many a general officer in my time at the academy, not our dean of faculty or not our superintendent necessarily, but at Air University, I had one general officer say, "Why in the heck do I have a poet, Brian Turner, come into my schoolhouse? What's the point of studying history? It's all about future studies." So that experience is not isolated. And as I understand your argument, Claudia, within this 5th century Athenian rise and decline of democracy, we see the Athenian experience bookended by war, the Persian War and the Peloponnesian War. And so my first question for you, specifically about the chapters, is do you see these texts as a form of war literature? And perhaps that's the point of entree for military thinkers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that can be overstated, the extent to which the Greeks saw themselves as citizen soldiers. If you were strong enough and able-bodied to pick up the shield and the spear, you went out and you stood in the lines. And the way Greek literature has developed around these more or less ritualistic practices of absorbing the war experience and integrating these returning bloodied men back into the polis. I think it is war literature, certainly Homer's Iliad. Herodotus makes it very clear that if they hadn't faced that Persian invasion, the Greeks would have just, I don't know what they would have done. Petty little bickering, I guess. And Thucydides. I have made the case in the book that it is through war that we learn who we are. But I've also made the case that we have to be willing to look at the lesson that war is trying to teach us. Because there are some wars, like what happened with the Athenians and some recent conflicts with the United States and the Middle East, where I think if we don't look directly at what debacles they were, we will never learn the right lesson and never then proceed into that more moral or ethical quest to try to better understand virtue.
Great.
Could I ask a follow-up about the connection between the history that's the background to your arc of chapters and then the philosophy and the books, right? The thinkers who are the subject matter of each chapter. It struck me that thinking of Greek humanism as a kind of single whole, Herodotus looks like he's an early version of Greek humanism. And he appears and he's active when he's thinking about the growth of Greek military power. But you present Aristotle as the real flowering of the Greek humanist tradition, and he's active in a time when Athenian military power, at least, is on the wane. Athens has been crushed, in a sense. Can you say a little bit about how you understand the connection between those two things? Is the philosophy coming after the historical events? Is there some kind of necessary connection between the history of war and the philosophy? What's your sense of that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I have thought a lot about whether this is a history book or not. My gut sense is that it is not, because what it is really concerned with is the way an individual human being comes into an awareness of her agency, of her freedom, of her ability to take risks, of her ability to engage in the contest. And that's, when I think of Herodotus, that's what he's documenting about the Greek spirit, is that they are coming to a place of self-realization. Is that a historical phenomenon? I guess, I think if they hadn't faced the Persian invasion, probably would not have come about, at least not in that way. But I think Aristotle is the culmination of that, for the Greeks at least, with this teleological ethics, with this idea that we're situated in the midst of a world that is not constructed, as the post-Cartesians might want to make it out, but a world that has grown, and a world into which we are growing, and that we can find our ethical reasoning through asking, how am I doing? How am I doing? I also wanted to get the question in there about ends versus means, because the word telos means goal or end. I think Aristotle is really trying to help us see that what we choose to put our strategic focus on is really going to have an impact on how we do. And Herodotus documents the ways in which those lesser choices, the choice of gold in Croesus' case, the choice of conquest in Cyrus's case, or Xerxes, that those lesser choices somehow don't help us build our humanity. But the book is a bit of a hybrid. I'm sure Lewis and Alex are chuckling now behind their screens, because they really set out with Political Animal Press to bridge the gap between theory and practice. And I feel like this book so blatantly does that. I'm really grateful that they see the merit in it.
I wonder if I could jump in actually here, because your response to Jeff just made me think of a question that I can't believe I didn't think of earlier. Like, this is the moment that the question arose. I'm curious, the way that you just described telos helped me better understand maybe why you chose to title the book Strategic Humanism rather than Greek Humanism, since Greek Humanism is the kind of key phrase that organizes the two kind of paradigms or regimes that you describe in the book. And so I was wondering if that is an accurate kind of like interpretation. I'd love to hear a little bit about the title. The other reason I ask it is because one of what you ended with there, the description of the book as kind of in the spirit of Political Animal Press, bridging a kind of, bridging two different audiences, right? One of the things that I really liked about the book, and the way that I would describe this, is that I'm used to reading books that have a kind of narrow scholarly intervention. This book, I felt, was offering us what I would describe as a cultural intervention. So taking that scholarly background, the scholarly apparatus, and using it to intervene in a set of cultural values. And the way that you describe that set of cultural values is, on the one hand, right, we have the kind of techno scientific, quantitative regime and the set of values that it implies. And then we have this kind of humanistic regime, right, that we can trace back to the ancient Greeks. So I guess I just wanted to say, like, I like that framing of like the kind of larger cultural stakes, the values. And I'm wondering if, I'm curious, because strategic humanism kind of bridges those, right? On the one hand, you've got the strategy, to me, has that kind of techno sound to it, but humanism has all of the kind of, the more organic sort of way of thinking and talking about the human and, their ethical development or something like that. So anyway, it's a long roundabout way of asking you to talk a little bit about the title, which it strikes me now, it has touches on all of these different aspects of the book.
Oh, thank you. I love that question. We just read Aristotle's, some selections from Aristotle's Metaphysics in the Graduate Institute. And he, when he's starting to really push on this idea that this might be an ordered universe, this might be a rational and ordered universe, he uses the analogy of the strategos, the general. And he points out that without the general, the soldiers wouldn't really know where to go. And that was kind of, I think, I mean, the spirit behind choosing the word strategy. I would want to push back a little on whether that's just a techno or tactics kind of stand-in. I guess I wanted to draw a stronger distinction between tactics and strategy, because strategy means that we're striving for an ordered outcome and an outcome that's for the best. And the Greeks had to learn that lesson the hard way. Yeah. But I do use the phrase Greek humanism in the book. It's that process of learning what it means to be human, learning that I can use my language creatively to make an impact on the world around me that is the impact I want to make. But yeah, I think that for me really solidified it, is the strategist doesn't just say, take the hill, the strategist is like, what are we doing? And is it for the best?
And what values does taking the hill serve?
Right.
At the end of the day, what good is strategy if we lose our sense of the value of the individual? That seems to me the nugget, the takeaway from your book, that in this shift from the Homeric, heroic cultural sensibility, where the soldier, the foot soldier, the Myrmidon, Achilles, can be just disposed and mistreated and dishonored. That notion of time is violated in pursuit of some specious end. At the end of the day, you make the argument that the real genius of the trajectory of Greek thinking in the 5th century BCE is this realization of the inherent dignity and autonomy of the individual, who, as you say, she can determine her destiny. And so, to my mind, the real interesting and compelling and exciting tension in your book is it raises the question, what is the role of the individual within this thing, this big thing called strategy?
Yeah. And I guess I want to kind of tie that to Jeff's comment earlier and Amy's comment, because I think part of it means, for the Greeks at least, it means moving away from this sense that the gods have already determined your fate and you're just acting it out. And that's something I think Herodotus, so to bring up from Jeff's point, like why I think maybe Herodotus is not entirely just a historical narrative, because I think Herodotus is really wrestling with that question of like, well, you've got an oracle. It's a little ambiguous. How are you going to interpret it? What are you going to do with it? And you see an ever more complex relationship with this notion of the divine, to the point where the oracles begin to fall out of the picture during the Peloponnesian War. And certainly Aristotle wants to replace those anthropomorphic Olympian gods with some really beautiful intellectual ordered notion of some kind of creator who wants a rational cosmos. So I just wanted to do that, Tom. I feel like I didn't quite touch on your question.
Well, can I press you a little bit more on Herodotus, though, because you're saying such suggestive things. I'm wondering how far you're willing to take them. I'm thinking of something like this. Could we toy with the idea that Herodotus might be the peak of Greek humanism for something like the following reason? He's meditating on the flourishing of Greek military power, And he's seriously interested, and this was a very striking part of your chapter on Herodotus, he's seriously interested in sincerely held beliefs, right? You have an interpretation of what aletheia might mean, right? What the truth might mean. Aristotle looks more like a systematizer compared to Herodotus. He looks less like an inquirer and more like a rationalist dogmatist, doesn't he? So couldn't you say that maybe Aristotle is more characteristic of the decline of Greek humanism, and what we really need are military service members who are trained to think like Herodotus, to have multiple perspectives, to be interested in other cultures, and to always ask, tell me what you sincerely think. What do you think about that way of pushing Herodotus to the forefront?
Like, wow, yeah. I mean, I guess that's very provocative. Yeah, one thing I would say about Aristotle's ethics that has always struck me as very beautiful about this ethical fabric that he constructs is that he's expecting that you'll be out in the world interacting with people, bearing witness to their behaviors and having them bear witness to yours. So there's something incredibly social and interactive about a model like that. And I guess, yeah, we had a colleague in the philosophy, I had a colleague in the philosophy department at Air Force Academy who prefers the term neo-Aristotelianism because he wants to sort of sideline all of the ways in which Aristotle's ethics is obviously directed toward a very particular patriarchal aristocracy. But I think if you can hold it more as just a fabric of what a social and situational ethics would look like, then I think it's more successful. But I'm enchanted by your comment about Herodotus. That's what Robert Kaplan argues, is that only that kind of wild willingness to tell people stories and listen to them, and that willingness to travel into other cultures without judgment, without evangelizing, without being dogmatic, that is so unique. So yeah, that's the best I can do with that on the first fly, but I love that question.
Can I perhaps ask a quick follow-up? So I think that question is interesting in part because it brings into relief the importance of Bacon and Descartes to the book's argument. Because I think if there are figures that the book kind of points to as exemplary of systematic thinking, devoid of the kind of situatedness that you describe in Aristotle's philosophy, right? It's Bacon and Descartes. And so I was wondering, I don't know if now is the time to kind of bring these guys in, but okay, great. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to just read this lovely part of the book where you encapsulate the kind of role that they play in history and also for the book. So you write that today's academic emphasis on technical reason, which acknowledges only quantitative processes and results, is a consequence of this decisive turn away from the holistic human organism that so absorbed the Greeks. This modern development associated with widespread access to technology returns us to the paradigms of a scientific revolution that took place in the 16th and 17th centuries, about 100 years before the Enlightenment. This paradigm was introduced by Bacon and Descartes. These two men were responsible almost single-handedly for turning the focus of reason away from the contemplative traditions of the Greeks and the Christian fathers and toward the development of scientific processes that could proceed mechanically and thereby impersonally and inevitably toward a better philosophical quality of life for all humanity. I think it just, that portion just lays it out in like perfectly clear terms, kind of what the stakes are. And one of the questions I had as I was reading the chapter that focuses on Bacon and Descartes as a way of kind of contextualizing the different Greek thinkers that you line up later in the book. One of the questions I had was, they were writing during the Renaissance, during a kind of revival those very authors, right, in some cases. But certainly the Greek authors kind of came to greater prominence, you know, in the 17th century after the Latin, you know, roughly speaking, you know, both Latin and Greek writers, but really the Greeks, I think, kind of with Hobbes's translation, for example, of Thucydides, like really had a prominence or visibility. So I was wondering kind of if you had thoughts about how these two, you know, as you say, fathers of the kind of technocratic quantitative paradigm, there's that interesting tension there, like their relationship to the classical past in some ways like is so similar to our relationship to it because we've adopted their way of thinking about the world. So anyway, I was just wondering your thoughts about kind of their relationship to the classical past, or even more generally, the decision to choose Bacon and Descartes as the kind of origin point for this important story about science, right? And its relationship to humanism since the 17th century.
Well, and thank you. And just for the sake of the audience, Amy is a very prominent Baconian scholar, so she knows what she's talking about. and I want to say that I am not. I've read The Great Instauration, I've read The New Atlantis, I've read like stuff out of the philosophical treatises. And I don't doubt that Bacon was widely read, was widely reading Hellenic literature. But in the, like, for example, in The Great Instauration with the Four Idols, we see him decisively decide that the Aristotelian approach to science is just misguided. There's no point in contemplating the mysteries of the natural world. There's no point in asking why. You just hack it off, you ask how, and you hack it to pieces until you can manipulate it. And that has led to some of the greatest breakthroughs in the physical quality of life for billions of people. The development of fertilizers to grow crops where crops would never productively grow, the development of medicines. And Descartes also followed that path. I know you and I have discussed this privately. They took different methodological approaches. One was empirical, like let's just get our hands on it, right? And the other was let's develop a very sterile method. And that, I guess, is something I've never been very persuaded by, is the idea that the scientist could somehow not have an impact on the work. And Descartes even, I guess, makes a stronger case for your point, which is that for Descartes, it was kind of the deal with the devil, right? Like he wanted to have the Ivory Tower Academy where he could do the kind of studying of the Hellenics and pondering, but the only way he could get the academy to buy into that was by being like, here, we'll give you all this science, right, that you can use for the betterment of the physical quality of human life. I think one key phrase in what you read is, for the Greeks, it was the philosophical quality of life that was more important. They had not yet latched on to the idea that we could solve so many of these physical problems. And so they're really grappling with the life of the soul and how we respond to the inevitability of human suffering. And I was thinking this morning about the novel coronavirus, right? Like we're kind of right in that place right now. Like now all of a sudden we have a physical quality of life issue that we have not been able to solve. And that really illustrates, I think, to us that we have work to do in understanding how we are human. And that kind of work can't simply be done quantitatively. But I would never argue, and I think I told this to Jeff a few weeks ago, I would never argue that we should be like anti-Bacon or anti-Descartes. Like this science is like everything to us. It's just that we're applying these kinds of methodologies to areas of human life that can't be solved like that. The crises of the soul, the crises of the spirit, great theological questions. So that's where I'm trying to restore some balance, I guess, with that argument.
It's the job of the poet, right?
Right.
Homer Homer asked the big question, why do we suffer? Theogony in both his epics. And the answer is, in the Iliad, it's rage. It's Achilles' rage, why so much suffering and death is brought upon so many men. And in the Odyssey, it's recklessness. If only you curb your wild desires, dudes, you'll come home, Tiresias says. It takes a poet.
Well, and I'm not an expert on Bacon, but I have looked at this book he wrote called On the Wisdom of the Ancients, and it seems like his response to Greek poetry was to think it was concealed metaphysics, right? And so it looks like he's not taking it seriously on its face or on its surface as what it presents itself to be. He's looking for some hidden meaning, and maybe that's the general critique that both Bacon and Descartes make of the Greek predecessors. They knew things they didn't share with everybody. They were insufficiently humanitarian, right? So we have something like short-sighted humanitarianism versus long-sighted humanism as the axis of Claudia's book.
Well, and poetry is all about the half-said thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to talk more about poetry. I don't, because that really resonates with me. It resonates on the level of, it's through poetry that we can hold two things in juxtaposition that we wouldn't otherwise look at together. And that, I know you're such an amazing poet, Tom, and I just wonder, can we use poetry like this to juxtapose two trajectories in our development? so that just to get to Jeff's point, it's not like we're just being historians, but we're trying to see that if we hold these two things up next to each other, we're going to learn something about ourselves.
Isn't I think one of the implicit messages of your chapter on the Iliad, but also your emphasis on Aristotle, that Aristotle's notion of the holistic, integrated human being considers this thing called the human animal, the political animal, as more than just mind. We are an animal as well. And we have a limbic system. We have a paleo-mammalian brain. They didn't have that terminology then, but you betcha Homer understands the power of an image to move people. Images move people because images are arguments in their own right. They're arguments to the head and to the heart. And so that general who asked me, why should I pay for Brian Turner to come to my Air War College classroom or Air Command and Staff College classroom? My answer was, sir, Brian Turner was a striker team leader in Iraq for a year, and he told my class, my group of officer warriors who were, by the way, creative writers, that poetry saved him in Iraq. That poetry saved him because it teaches us to pay attention to the world. It teaches us to pay attention to this and to this. And if you're not paying attention to this and this, you die.
Yeah, and that gets to your earlier point about war literature, that the Greeks understood that there was a political and ritual context for the type of war literature that would help integrate the mind and the body. And I've been thinking about that because I do think war literature has become a much more specialized field where, you're supposed to write it if you're a returning soldier and you're going to somehow use it in a certain way. But I wonder how much we've lost by neglecting the, and also just, I guess, how much we've lost because so few people will have ever had those kinds of experiences that will make them pick up a volume of Brian Turner's poems.
But isn't the survival of our democracy to know what what kinds of wars and what the cost of war is that we send people off to fight, to do our bidding and pay our tax dollars for? I mean, I've made the argument long and hard, and so has my esteemed colleague Donald Anderson and people like Jesse Goolsbee, that you know, any democracy worth its salt needs to have war literature within the curriculum in our universities, in our civilian universities, and in our high schools. Where else are you going to know what happens in war? How else are you going to know about it? Not some Hollywood film.
And yet we pick up the newspaper November 11th after November 11th and read about the greatest generation, and there's no lip service paid to those who suffered in Iraq or Vietnam, because we don't want to look at conflicts like that. Whatever the lesson they taught us was a lesson about our own moral bankruptcy. And that's kind of my point in the book about the Peloponnesian War, is that you kind of have to look long and hard at that if you want to see this regrowth or this rebirth, this generative moral sensibility.
Right.
And I worry that's another area, Amy, where I worry that technocracy is at work. We medicate ourselves with our devices and our lack of ability. So those are all like related thoughts for me, for sure, about all this. I think that might be the next project I work on, is just looking at the way, you know, as soon as you bring this device into your life, your choices about what the next thing you bring into your life are going to get like ever narrower and narrower. And I do think Herodotus is an example of just don't let the full spectrum of human choice or human judgment, don't let that just inevitably contract. And how do we hang on to that at an age which seems so imperiled in terms of what we're giving up in terms of human judgment?
Yeah. It's to me really to pose a practical difficulty with the project, which I endorse, of a return to Aristotle as a kind of, as a human being. Aristotle, you know, he makes it clear first that his arguments about moral virtue depend on having spent your childhood in a certain way. And I'd say at least part of that has to be some more direct experience with military service, right? Or at least preparation for military service that Aristotle might have been able to expect of his readers, but we can't expect of most of our students today. So is there any remedy for this kind of difficulty, that the foundation of the Aristotelian education is not something, and I mean the very early foundations aren't something that we seem to share so much anymore? Is there a way around that?
Wow.
Establish a civilian conservation corps, which is required service for every young man and woman of 18 years of age in our country to address climatic change disasters. Civil service.
Yeah, you have
service to the community.
You have to look at that when you read book 3 of the Ethics, and he's like, oh, you know, courage is what is it you're willing to die for? And you look around the classroom and you're like, I wonder how many people out here are willing to die for something. And but when you start talking about it with them, you realize you can read it a little bit figuratively as geared toward what are you willing to earnestly sacrifice blood and sweat and tears for. But yeah, definitely for Aristotle, there was only one way to courage.
Jeff, when I read your response, we had a little exchange via email prior, and part of what was in my mind about maybe the implausibility of returning to some sort of Aristotelian paradigm where we might engage in sort of the contemplation of value ethics. There are also certainly socio and economic impediments to that. You know, the whole notion of the academy and the schola, the school the Greek notion of school comes from the idea of, is based on leisure. And so much of our culture does not have access to leisure because of economic impediments, let alone the educational training that might allow for that. Is that where you were going with your retort?
Yeah, that's part of it. I just meant to maybe focus on a little slice of it that seems to me problematic, but there are all sorts of questions of how to adapt Aristotle to our context. And I think it goes back to the question of, how strongly we think that Aristotle originated out of a particular historical moment in Athens or for the Greeks. I don't think it's impossible, but we have to think of things like the Civilian Conservation Corps or mandatory civilian service, or just ways of thinking about what the foundational experiences of our students are more generally, that would then, think about the list of virtues and the way they would ascend in thinking through them, that kind of mirrors what Aristotle is up to.
It strikes me too that one of the challenges, having taught for a couple of years now at the Air Force Academy, is that those are students who have signed up for that kind of service. But and it's easy to forget this, they're not veterans. They haven't had those experiences. So in a lot of ways, reading war literature with them, and I think of that term very broadly because I'm in agreement with you, Claudia. When I teach Shakespeare, there is so much war in Shakespeare, right? Even though he's not a canonical war, writer. And so I feel the differences in teaching, war through Shakespeare to a civilian audience and the cadet audience, there just aren't that many differences. They're very similar populations. They're young and they haven't had, the kinds of experiences that veterans have had, so they're so far away from Brian Turner, for example, that in some ways teaching this literature is one way that they, one of their earliest experiences of war is through poetry or through drama or something like that, and so I wonder if that's kind of a way of bridging Jeff, your question about how do we give them real world experiences in something like a corps, right, where they engage in service. And then Tom, your proposal that war literature be a component of just the way that we teach literature, right, anywhere, not just at the military academies. I wonder if it's all kind of that's already there. It's just that I can't remember ever being told to pay attention to the war that was already in those plays. You know what I mean? It's almost it's not that we're teaching the wrong things. It's that we ourselves, I think, have to help them learn to see what's already there, right? And I think that that's a huge kind of payoff of this book, that you can read those authors through that kind of lens. And the book so kind of deftly then connects that to contemporary wars that we're all familiar with. I mean, the book models how to do that kind of teaching, I think.
Well, thank you, Amy. And it gets me thinking about how do we work with the naive generation, and Tom and I have done Brian Dory's now with both hardened combat veterans from Fort Carson and also with Air Force Academy cadets. And how do you, now Brian Dory's, for those who aren't familiar with his work, he takes Greek tragedy and he brings it into traumatized communities, whether it's veterans communities is how he got started, but he brought Antigone into Ferguson, Maryland, or Ferguson, Missouri after the Black Lives, one of the early Black Lives Matter deaths. And he's branching out and he's trying to think, how can I use tragedy as a techne, as a basic artifact to help a community understand both that it has traumatized veterans in its midst, if you will, but also that it has very idealistic young people. That's the Aristotle question as well, is how does childhood how does childhood relate to um, being a grown-up and knowing the full, well, we hopefully won't ever know, but feel, it was the Greeks who said life is suffering, right? And I guess that's another thing I worry about the post-Cartesian paradigm, is that it's a little bit palliative. It's like we could just take a painkiller and get rid of the suffering, right? But the Greeks were like, no, like you have to do something so much more essential with that suffering. Um, and I feel like that's very, very much needed.
Yeah, Odysseus, the consummate warrior, he's made ready to be home. He's made ready to cleanse the kingdom because he learns from his suffering. Brian Dories as well. You and I are both big fans of him and his work. He in a nutshell, he says the purpose of teaching these ancient Greek stories is it's really their narrative value, and I think this ties to Jeff's points about Herodotus and your whole project. You're telling the story of the birth and the development and the decline of Athenian democracy in a very short span of time. Frank O'Connor, the great Irish writer, I got to get the Irish in here, he said that the historian and the novelist are bedfellows. The historian is a bedfellow of the novelist. We're all storytellers, man. And what we're doing is we're hunters and gatherers of values that help us survive in a really dangerous and perilous world. And to my mind, that's the value of the humanities across the board. And to survive, we have to ask those metaphysical questions, not just the how, but the why. And we have to ask that question of why do we suffer? And we may not get a good answer. It may just be purely stupid and futile. But at the end of the day, Dory says this about the tragedies and Greek humanism, that we read and we watch and tell stories to know we're not alone in our suffering. And that's a source of incredible strength, and it builds community.
Yeah, that's another reason I would put out there that an Aristotelian sort of demos or polis oriented ethical paradigm is probably superior to the Cartesian ethical paradigms, because the Cartesian ethical paradigms ask us to make the decision alone, as though we're alone. But whereas the Aristotelian paradigm is much more like, well, what's going on right over there, and who are the people, and what are they feeling, and so you're making a very situational and very embodied assessment of what a moderate path forward might look like. I mean, yeah. I've been,
our effective nature as well.
And the word embodied is really resonating with me, just because we live out our lives over time and space. And I feel like I look, at our young people. And there's nothing, no, it's all good. It's just that, that notion that, and I think, Tom, you brought up the word when we were talking about this earlier, integrated, this notion that we would be integrated into our environments. Jeff, is that persuasive? I know you were the one who was pushing a little harder on Cartesian.
Well, it is, and I'm also very taken with this contrast, which hadn't really occurred to me until I heard you all kind of frame it this way. How strong the contrast is between the Greek tragic attitude, pathein mathein, to suffer is to learn, and the relief of man's estate, which I take it to be, the Baconian formula that indicates suffering is always a bad sign. Right? To suffer is to somehow be subtracted from, right? Rather than to change in a beneficial way. So yeah, there does seem to be something in there that should be possible to organize for curricula for our students, right? To implement in a practical way. And I do think poetry and war literature have a lot to teach us.
Yeah, and I taught the ethics and technology class the last semester at Air Force Academy, last last fall, I guess. And I was sort of stunned that they didn't, that the phrase Cartesian revolution didn't really register with them. I had to actually walk them through it. I had to have them read the discourse from the Discourse on the Method. I had to have them read a little bit about Bacon with the Mastery of Nature passage. But this whole idea that we would have taken this radical turn in the West away from embodied and integrated and into mind, just, and that they wouldn't know that, like, that was
They
stunning.
breathe it every day, and we breathe it. And we're mixed metaphors. We're drinking the Kool-Aid. No, it's good Kool-Aid. There's a great story called the Kool-Aid Wino. Go read that story. Claudia, we're winding down. I think we've got about 5 minutes left. Is that correct, Lewis and Alex? So do you have any final thoughts? Or maybe we could, I mean, in a nutshell, if we'd like to go around to the discussants, Jeff and Amy, do you want to add anything while Claudia gathers her thoughts or closing thoughts?
Well, all I'll say is that this is such a fruitful book. I feel like I could talk about it for hours yet. I mean, we haven't even touched on something that's close to my heart and I think matters to Amy, whether there's daylight between Bacon and Descartes on these points, whether there's a whole road not taken that might have been better that could incorporate technology but keep a more embodied orientation. So yeah, it's just been a pleasure talking with you all, and thank you, Claudia, for writing this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Jeff said. Huge pleasure reading the book, especially as someone who thinks about the relationship between the early modern period and the classical past and our relationship to those stories. I think the way that you've constellated these authors gives us a completely different kind of story about the history of science and technology. And so I wish I had, there's so much more to say about the history that you tell here. So thank you.
So we have about 3 more minutes, Claudia, and I think I'll just turn it over to you.
Okay, well, I don't have 3 minutes, but I just wanted to, I was thinking about your comments about poetry, Tom, and I put the line in the introduction, right? History, where Mark Twain says, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And I'm really enchanted with that work of trying to find the rhyme, trying to find that poetic juxtaposition that can help us see what lesson we need to learn in the present that the past is trying to give voice to. So, and I thank you for your kind words, Amy and Jeff and Tom. You're too kind. And I'm really grateful for your support. And thanks to Lewis and Alex for picking up the book and being just so unconditionally awesome as editors.
Thank you, Claudia. So yeah, and just by way of conclusion, I'll say here, thanks to all of you, thanks to Tom for leading this terrific discussion. I think, as Jeff said, it's one that could go on a very long way, but at least so many themes in a book rich with important themes were touched upon ably here. And I want to thank all of you for that, for making the time and participating. To Claudia again for writing the book. And we are very proud of it. To people, we want to thank all the viewers who watched live, as well as the many others who will watch this afterwards. Claudia's book is available on our press website, Political Animal Press, also through many other fine online retailers. And we want to encourage everyone to read it and think through these things even more deeply. Thanks again, Tom, Jeff, Amy, and of course, Claudia. Alex, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, thank you all. It's been a really interesting discussion, and any of the viewers who wanted to continue the discussion or with a follow-up question, just reminding you, you can post it as a comment to this video or direct message us and we'll pass it on. So thanks again.
Thanks to everyone and have a good night. Bye for now.